Good afternoon everyone, I'm Robert from El Magnifico Games. Tonight we're going to continue our poetry, prose and riddles stream, but before that I would just like to thank all the, I think it was about 24 people that just followed me out of nowhere. I don't know what I've done to deserve that, but thank you, I appreciate it. So, thank you. Poetry, I suppose. Sorry, it's taking me quite by surprise. I really wasn't expecting it, but... Poetry. Last week, we finished on a poem by Sir William Davenant. It appeared to only be entitled Song. I'm assume that's because it's part of... oh, sorry, Jenny. I said 24 people. About 24 people. I know, it was extremely unexpected. I think it was actually more than 24. I don't remember my precise follower count before. I think it might have been 11, which would mean 25 people followed me out of the blue. So yes, thank you to each and every one of you. What was I thinking? Sir William Davenant. Yes, the title of the poem was, it seems to be song. I assume that's because it's from a larger work or from an untitled work. So, as usual, I'll begin by reading the last poem we finished on and then move on to the next one. Jenny said suddenly they learned how good this channel is. Well, I don't know about that, but thank you. So yes, reading. The lark now leaves his watery nest, and climbing shakes his dewy wings. He takes a window for the east, and to implore your light he sings, "Awake, awake, the morn will never rise, till she can dress her beauty at your eyes." The merchant bows unto the seaman's star, the ploughman from the sun his season takes, but still the lover wonders what they are, who look for the day before his mistress wakes. Awake, awake, break through your veils of lawn, then draw your curtains and begin the dawn. So this poem is obviously about love and I suppose the way you acclimatise towards being with someone you are romantically in love with. We obviously discussed it last week, but I will say I do really like this one. I think I do appreciate this poem in particular. I think it's well written. So, the next poem by John Dryden is a song for St. Cecilia's Day, 1687. Jenny says, I see the merchant. Oh, that's the merchant bows unto the seaman's star, the ploughman from the sun his season takes. I think they're referring to how in different professions they would get up at different times and determine what they were doing in the day based on different what's the word? Different. I'm sorry, my mind's going blank. I can't think of the right word. There would be different signals from which they would, which would dictate their daily routine. And then the poem goes on to say, but still the lover wonders what they are. And here they're using lover as though it were a profession, you know, in contrast to the merchant and the ploughman, who look for the day before his mistress wakes. So they're saying that the lover, the one who is in love, can't imagine how anyone could look for a day, that is, start their day before his mistress wakes, because that's what begins his day. That's the signal he takes to start the day. No, that's fine, Jenny. This stream is all about discussing poetry, so if you have anything to contribute, please do so. Now, the next thing to do is look up John Dryden and then St. Cecilia's Day, because I don't actually know anything about St. Cecilia's Day. Apologies, slight technical difficulties. I see what was going on. Sorry about that. So, John Dryden. Uh, 1631 to 1700 was an English poet, literary critic, translator and playwright who was appointed England's first poet laureate in 1668. He is seen as dominating the literary life of Restoration England to such a point that the period came to be known in literary circles as the Age of Dryden. Romanticist writer Sir Walter Scott called him Glorious John. Oh, that's very interesting. That does make him early, though. If this was... well, they say Restoration, but this wouldn't have been this would have been pre-Glorious Revolution, even. So, yes, as Wikipedia points out, that's Charles II's time. So the Civil War had happened, Cromwell had been and passed on, and and England was restored to being a monarchy, and but this was pre-Glorious Revolution. Although, actually, I say that would have been presumably when he was at his height. I'm pretty sure the Glorious Revolution... Oh yeah, because they say here in 1668 to 1688, pretty sure the Glorious Revolution would have been in his lifetime towards the end. Yeah, 1688. So the year that he ceased to be poet laureate, assuming that's what they... Yes, that's what they meant by in office. The year in January. Okay. So this is making sense. He was appointed England's first poet laureate, and he was in office during Charles II's reign, but the Glorious Revolution happened in his lifetime, but after he had left office. So that makes sense. So yeah, this is early. Dryden was born in the village rectory of Aldwinkle near Thrapston in Northamptonshire, where his maternal grandmother was the rector of All Saints. So, religion clearly featured in his upbringing. He was, more than usual in those days, of course. There would have been religion in people's upbringing back then. He was the eldest of 14 children born to Erasmus Dryden and his wife Mary Pickering, paternal grandson of Sir Erasmus Dryden, first baronet. I see, and wife Frances Wilkes, Puritan landowning gentry who supported the Puritan cause in Parliament. He was a second cousin once removed of Jonathan Swift. Oh, interesting. As a boy, Dryden lived in the nearby village of Titchmarsh, where it is likely that he received his first education. In 1644, he was sent to Westminster School as a King's Scholar, where his headmaster was Dr. Richard Busby, a charismatic teacher and severe disciplinarian. Having been refounded by Elizabeth I, Westminster during this period embraced a very different religious and political spirit, encouraging royalism and high Anglicanism. Whatever Dryden's responses was, he clearly respected the headmaster and would later send two of his sons to school at Westminster. As a humanist public school, Westminster maintained a curriculum which trained pupils in the art of rhetoric and the presentation of arguments for both sides of a given issue. This is a skill which would remain with Dryden and influence his later writing and thinking, as much of it displays free dialectical patterns. The Westminster curriculum included weekly translation assignments which developed Dryden's capacity for assimilation. This was also to be exhibited in his later works. His years at Westminster were not uneventful, and his first published poem, an elegy with a strong royalist feel on the death of his schoolmate Henry, Lord Hastings, from smallpox, alludes to the execution of King Charles I, which took place on the 30th of January 1649, very near the school where Dr. Busby had first prayed for the king, and then locked in his schoolboys to prevent their attending the spectacle. Blimey. It's strange reading an account about these events, which, you know, you think of as being incredibly historical, and indeed they are, but, you know, everyone knows that King Charles I was executed, but then to hear a story about a schoolmaster who locked his schoolboys in to prevent them attending the spectacle and so on, I don't know, it just makes it seem more real. In 1650, Dryden went up to Trinity College, Cambridge, where he would have experienced a return to the religious and political ethos of his childhood. The Master of Trinity was a Puritan preacher by the name of Thomas Hill, who had been a rector in Dryden's home village. Though there is little specific information on Dryden's undergraduate years, he would most certainly have followed the standard curriculum of classics, rhetoric and mathematics. In 1654 he obtained his BA, graduating top of the list for Trinity that year. In June of the same year, Dryden's father died, leaving him some land which generated a little income but not enough to live on. Returning to London during the Protectorate, Dryden obtained work with Oliver Cromwell's Secretary of State, John Thurlow. This appointment may have been the result of influence exercised on his behalf by his cousin, the Lord Chamberlain, Sir Gilbert Pickering. At Cromwell's funeral on the 23rd of November 1658, Dryden processed with the Puritan poets John Milton and Andrew Marvell. Shortly thereafter, he published his first Puritan poem, Heroic Stanzas, a eulogy on Cromwell's death, which is cautious and prudent in its emotional display. In 1660, Dryden celebrated the restoration of the monarchy and the return of Charles II with Astrea Redux, an authentic royalist panegyric. Panegyric? I'm not sure. In this work, the interregnum is illustrated as a time of chaos, and Charles is seen as the restorer of peace and order. That's very interesting. I didn't know there was such publicly... I didn't know there were people who were so publicly royalist during the Protectorate. You'd have assumed it would have been in their interest not to, but the fact that he, in fact, where was it? Obtained work with Oliver Cromwell's Secretary of State was being clearly publicly royalist is, well, I find very surprising. So clearly, this poet both lived in but from the fact that he became the first poet laureate, it's clear that he was considered an exceptional individual at the time, and he was clearly living during very interesting times. Anyway, that's given us some background on who he was, and perhaps what we can expect to see in his poetry. Now, what is St. Cecilia's Day? Was a Roman martyr venerated in Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican and some Lutheran churches such as the Church of Sweden. She became the patroness of music and musicians. Now that's interesting because, of course, Cromwell famously banned music, didn't he? It being written that, as the musicians played at her wedding, Cecilia sang in her heart to the Lord. Musical compositions are dedicated to her and her feast on the 22nd of November. Is the occasion of concerts and music festivals. St. Cecilia is one of several virgin martyrs commemorated by name in the canon of the Mass in the Latin Church, the Church of Santa Cecilia in Trastevere, which I must be mispronouncing, founded in the 3rd century by Pope Urban I. It is believed to be on the site of the house where she lived and died. Okay. So this is a royalist poet writing a poem about, it would seem, the patron saint of music's day during the Protectorate in England. Interesting. So, I will begin the first reading. From harmony, from heavenly harmony, this universal frame began, when nature underneath a heap of jarring atoms lay, and could not heave her head. The tuneful voice was heard from high, Arise, ye more than dead. Then cold and hot and moist and dry, in order to their stations leap, and music's power obey, from heavenly harmony. This universal frame began, from harmony to harmony, through all the compass of the notes it ran, the diapason closing full in man. What passion cannot music raise and quell, when Jubal struck the chorded shell? His listening brethren stood around, and wondering on their faces fell, to worship that celestial sound, less than a god they thought there could not dwell, within the hollow of that shell, that spoke so sweetly and so well. What passion cannot music raise and quell? The trumpet's loud clangour excites us to arms, with shrill notes of anger and mortal alarms. The double beat of the thundering drum cries, Hark, the foes come! Charge, charge, 'tis too late to retreat. The soft complaining flute in dying notes discovers the woes of hopeless lovers, whose dirge is whispered by the warbling lute. Sharp violins proclaim their jealous pangs and desperation, fury, frantic indignation, depths of pains and height of passion for the fair disdainful dame. But oh, what art can teach, what human voice can reach, the sacred organ's praise, notes inspiring holy love, notes that wing their heavenly ways, to mend the choirs above. Orpheus could lead the savage race, and trees uprooted left their place. Sequacious of the lyre, but bright Cecilia raised the wonder higher, when to her organ vocal breath was given. An angel heard and straight appeared, mistaking earth for heaven. As from the power of sacred lays the spheres began to move, and sung the great Creator's praise to all the blessed above. So when the last and dreadful hour this crumbling pageant shall devour, the trumpet shall be heard on high, the dead shall live, the living die, and music shall untune the sky. That was incredibly interesting. I also suspect this is going to take a while to analyse. So, I suppose beginning with any words we're unsure about, I want to double check to begin with, I want to double check what they mean by frame. Because I understand that it presumably be referring to a section within a piece of music, but I want to know if it's got a much more specific meaning than that. Oh, maybe it doesn't have any musical connotations. The most likely I found is frame of mind or disposition. But that's quite different to what I was initially thinking it would mean. I'm going to check my physical dictionary to see if it has a different definition. Jenny says, I checked out St. Cecilia just now. It looks like to me this is a poem written for the celebration of a Catholic character. I wouldn't assume that. Because of course she's, as the Wikipedia page suggested, she is venerated in Anglican churches as well. I mean, obviously she was a Roman martyr, but it sounds like, yeah, founded in the Church of Santa Cecilia was founded in the 3rd century, so she was clearly a very, very early figure in Christianity. So I'd suggest that she probably predates the splitting of the church. So I wouldn't say she's specifically Roman Catholic, because I mean she clearly massively predates the schism between the Catholic Church and Protestantism, but she would also predate the schism between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. So just it appears she comes out of early Christianity. Yes, I was about to look up and see if there was another definition of frame which might shed some light on this poem. There's under the definitions of frame here, there's one that says framed work or structure, as in the frame of heaven or earth. So that's another possibility. This universal frame could be referring to the structure of the universe. I can't find a better definition than that, so that's what I would assume it's referring to. So from harmony, from heavenly harmony, this universal frame began. So I wonder if they're suggesting that it was directly from the harmony within heaven that the universe began, and so they're actually trying to draw an analogy by using specific words with multiple meanings between music and between three things: music, heaven, and the universe. When nature underneath a heap of jarring atoms lay. I'm not sure what they mean by jarring atoms, I must admit. I really don't know what they would mean by jarring atoms. The thing is, this of course massively predates modern atomic theory. Now the word atom comes from Greek and it means something that's indivisible, and certainly for a very long time we've had a notion that things are made of smaller things, and that if you kept on getting smaller and smaller and smaller, it's likely you'd reach a point where you'd find something that's indivisible. And so the sort of concept of an atom has been around for a long time, but the specifics haven't been known. And so, to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure what a 17th century Englishman would have meant when they said jarring atoms. And unfortunately, the definitions that we find on Wiktionary are very likely to be biased by modern science. History of science, a hypothetical particle posited by Greek philosophers as an ultimate and indivisible component of matter, and they say from the 15th century. But clearly, these Greek philosophers, which are being referred to here, would have been ancient Greek philosophers, or rather, I'm fairly certain that is the case. So that it would have been much earlier than the 15th century. The smallest indivisible constituent part or unit of something. The logical atomism. A fundamental fact that cannot be further broken down. The smallest medieval unit of time equal to 15/94 of a second. That raises more questions than it answers. 15/94. Very interesting. But off topic. A very small amount of wit. Yeah. Okay. Okay, what would they mean by jarring? Because when I think of something as being jarring, I think of it as being surprising. But I wonder if there's some other meaning here. Incongruous, conflictful. That which clashes or disagrees. Interesting. I think I've got a theory as to what that first part of the poem means. It's just I'm frankly a little surprised by how sophisticated it is in its thinking. I think what it's suggesting is that when the universe was created, there was a disordered heap of incongruous atoms, as in indivisible parts, and it's nature which forms them into order. But nature itself could not do so. It required a tuneful voice from high, so the harmony of heaven, to order all these atoms together into either nature itself or something that nature could work with. Which, although clearly religiously, clearly very biased by religion and its thinking, is frankly very sophisticated thinking, as I suggested. So from heavenly harmony, this universal frame began, when nature underneath a heap of jarring atoms lay, and could not heave a head, The tuneful voice was heard from high, "Arise ye more than dead." Arise ye more than dead. Now that almost sounds like they're not distinguishing between things that are dead and things that are inanimate. Which I suppose we do sometimes do today. You know, if you looked at a desolate wasteland, you might call it dead, even though in reality you might not see much evidence of death. You're just looking at something which isn't very full of life. Then cold and hot and moist and dry, in order to their stations leap. Okay, so I think what that might be suggesting is that at first the universe was neither hot or cold or moist or dry. It was without any of these properties. Or perhaps it was somewhere between them. And then, in order to their stations leap, is referring to them coming into being as states. And music's power obey. From harmony, from heavenly harmony, this universal frame began. From harmony to harmony, through all the compass of the notes it ran, the diapason closing full in man. So what is that word? The musical octave. Oh. I mean, that's a very clear and concise definition. I just wasn't familiar with it. Through all. So through all the notes. So the diapason. Hold on, how is it actually pronounced? It doesn't have any audio, and my IPA isn't brilliant. I think it might be diapason. I could be wrong though. Diapason, I'm guessing. The diapason closing full in man, presumably meaning that all elements of, or all constituent parts of the universe are within man, presumably. What passion cannot music raise and quell, when Jubal struck the chorded shell? Jubal. Is that a mythological figure or a biblical figure? Jubal. Jubal is a biblical figure in Genesis 4:21 of the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament. Mentioned only once, he is sometimes regarded by Christians, particularly by medieval commentators, as the inventor of music. A descendant of Cain, his father is Lamech and his brother is Jabal. Jubal is only known from his appearance in Genesis 4:21 of the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament. The account describes him as a descendant of Cain and the son of Lamech and Ada. He is also brother of Jabal and half-brother of Tubal-Cain and Naamah. Genesis credits him as the forefather of certain instruments, the Sinor and Ugab. The translations of these vary depending on the editions. He was the ancestor of those who play the lyre and pipe. The New Revised Standard Version. He was father of all such as handle the harp and organ. King James. He is father of all who play stringed instruments and pipes. Hmm. So, what passion cannot music raise and quell when Jubal struck the corded shell? I'm guessing corded shell is... Hold on, do they mean chord in any sense other than... Well, they wouldn't mean a musical chord, would they? And that's spelt differently anyway, fitted with a chord. Maybe they mean chord as in a piece of string or twine. Yeah. So perhaps they're suggesting he had a shell with a chord on it and he turned it into an instrument. His listening brethren stood around, and wondering on their faces fell to worship that celestial sound, less than a god they thought there could not dwell within the hollow of that shell that spoke so sweetly and so well, what passion cannot music raise and quell. Okay, so that suggests that the poem seems to be suggesting that he created some stringed instrument, perhaps similar to a guitar. I'm guessing, since it talks about striking, I'm assuming this is played with the hands as opposed to with some other implement like a violin would be. And that was the origin of music. The trumpet's loud clangor excites us to arms with shrill notes of anger and mortal alarms. The double 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 beat of the thundering drum cries hark, the foes come, charge Charles, 'tis too late to retreat. The soft-complaining flute in dying notes discovers the woes of hopeless lovers, whose dirge is whispered by the warbling lute. Sharp violins proclaim their jealous pangs and desperation, fury, frantic indignation, depths of pains and height of passion. For the fair disdainful dame, but oh, what art can teach, what a human voice can reach, the sacred organ's praise, notes inspiring holy love, notes that wing their heavenly ways to mend the choirs above. Orpheus could lead the savage race. Orpheus. Oh, of course, I said earlier he was publishing poetry in praise of music during the Protectorate, but this was during Charles II's time. So I don't know if he was that far back. He's certainly openly royalist during the Protectorate, which seems surprising. But it's possible he wasn't praising music till later. Orpheus is a Thracian bard, legendary musician and prophet in the ancient Greek religion. He was also a renowned poet, and according to legend travelled with Jason and the Argonauts in search of the Golden Fleece, and even descended into the underworld of Hades to recover his lost wife, Eurydice, which I'm probably mispronouncing. The major stories about him are centered on his ability to charm all living things and even stones with his music, the usual seen in Orpheus' mosaics. His attempt to retrieve his wife Eurydice from the underworld and his death at the hands of the Maenads of Dionysus, who, tired of his mourning for his late wife Eurydice. As an archetype of inspired singer, Orpheus is one of the most significant figures in the reception of classical mythology in Western culture, portrayed or alluded to in countless forms of art and popular culture, including poetry, film, opera, music, and painting. For the Greeks, Orpheus was a founder and prophet of the so-called Orphic Mysteries. He was credited with the composition of the Orphic hymns and the Orphic Argonautica. Shrines containing purported relics of Orpheus were regarded as oracles. Interesting. Orpheus could lead the savage race, and trees uprooted left their place. That sounds like a specific reference, as opposed to generally about Orpheus. That sounds like a specific incident. Singing Orpheus' music and singing could charm birds fish and wild beasts, coax the trees and rocks into dance. Mentions Orpheus is repeatedly referred to by I'm having difficulty. Euripides, in whom we find the first allusion to the connection of Orpheus with Dionysus and the infernal regions. He speaks of him as related to the Muses, mentions the powers of his song over rocks, trees, and wild beasts. And a jocular refers to his charming the infernal powers, connects him with bacchanalian orgies, ascribing to him the origin of sacred mysteries. Okay. So I wonder if... So when they say Orpheus could lead the savage race, I wonder if they mean animals, or if they mean a specific group of humans, or something else. Sequacious of the lyre. Now, to sequester something is to take it, isn't it? Sequacious. To follow. Likely to follow a yield to physical pressure, easily shaped or moulded. Also like plastic. Of people likely to follow, conform or yield to others, especially showing unthinking adherence to others' ideas, easily led. Of music, notes or poetic feet, following neatly or smoothly. Of thought following logically or in an unvarying and orderly procession, tending in a single intellectual direction. So what would sequacious of the lyre mean? That he played it in a very orderly way in which notes followed smoothly from each other? Presumably, but bright Cecilia raised the wonder higher when to her organ vocal breath was given. An angel heard and straight appeared, mistaking earth for heaven. As from the power of sacred lays, I'm not sure what a sacred lay is. We're looking for a noun, aren't we? Arrangement or relationship, the lay of the land, a share of profit, the direction of a rope is twisted. A place or activity where someone spends a significant portion of their life. A layer. A basis or ground. As from the power of sacred lays, the spheres began to move. I'm not sure what they mean by a sacred lay. And sung the great Creator's praise to all the blessed above, so when the last and dreadful hour the crumbling pageant shall devour, the trumpet shall be heard on high, the dead shall live, the living die, and music shall untune the sky. I'm not certain what that means. I'm not sure what they mean by sacred lays. And I'm not sure what they're referring to in the grand chorus at the end. An elaborate public display, especially a parade in historical tradition or a traditional costume, that's a pageant. A spectacular ceremony. See, I wonder if by pageant, this crumbling pageant shall devour. See, if it said be devoured, I would think the crumbling pageant is referring to our life. Well, this was obviously written historically, but at the time, our life today. That is, their life then. But this seems to be suggesting that the pageant is doing the devouring. Let me check my physical dictionary for lay. Unfortunately, I did have a feeling that this one would take quite a bit of analysis. It's good though, I like it. A lay, short lyric or narrative poem meant to be sung. That sounds much more likely, doesn't it? I strongly suspect that's what they mean by as from the power of sacred lays. That's presumably sacred poetry. Ah, the trumpet shall be heard on high. That's a reference back to earlier when they talk about the trumpet being used in war, presumably. The dead shall live, the living die. Well, the dead shall live makes sense in the end times. Supposedly all those that died come back and are then judged by God. I'm not sure what they would mean by the living die. A music show and tune the sky. I'll double check pageant to make sure that there's nothing helpful there in my physical dictionary, although I'm not expecting to find much. Pageant, brilliant spectacle, especially procession arranged for effect, spectacular procession or play performed in the open, illustrating the history of a place. None of that really helps. Splendid display. Yeah, that's all we got. So when the last and dreadful hour this crumbling pageant shall devour could be when this crumbling pageant shall devour the last and dreadful hour. So perhaps the crumbling pageant is the present day, and by devour the last and dreadful hour they mean due to the unending march of time when it all comes to an end. That would make sense. Okay, so I think we've deciphered the meaning of almost all of this. So I'll read it again and then have a quick look at any rhyming structure and or rhythm, and then move on to the final reading, unless anyone has anything they'd like to discuss, in which case please put it in chat. From harmony, from heavenly harmony, this universal frame began, when nature underneath a heap of jarring atoms lay, and could not heave her head. The tuneful voice was heard from high, arise ye more than dead, then cold and hot and moist and dry, in order to their stations leap, and music's power obey. From harmony, from heavenly harmony, this universal frame began, from harmony to harmony, through all the compass of the notes it ran, the diapason closing full in man. When passion cannot music raise and quell, when jubal struck the chorded shell, his listening brethren stood around, and wondering on their faces fell, to worship that celestial sound, less than a god they thought there could not dwell, within the hollow of that shell, that spoke so sweetly and so well. What passion cannot music raise and quell? The trumpet's loud clangor excites us to arms, with its shrill notes of anger and mortal alarms. The double, double, double beat of the thundering drum cries, hark, the foes come. Charge, charge, 'tis too late to retreat. The soft complaining flute in dying notes discovers the woes of hopeless lovers, whose dirges whispered by the warbling lute. Sharp violins proclaim their jealous pangs and desperation, fury, frantic indignation, depths of pain and heights of passion, for the fair disdainful dame. But oh, what art can teach, what human voice can reach, the sacred organ's praise, notes inspiring holy love, notes that wing their heavenly ways to mend the choirs above. Orpheus could lead the savage race, and trees uprooted left their place, sequacious of the lyre, but bright Cecilia raised the wonder higher, when to her organ vocal breath was given, an angel heard and straight appeared, mistaking earth for heaven. As from the power of sacred lays the spheres began to move, and sung the great Creator's praise to all the blessed above. So when the last and dreadful hour this crumbling pageant shall devour, the trumpet shall be heard on high, the dead shall live, the living die, and music shall entune the sky. I do like the allusion, I think, if I'm understanding correctly, to music having come from heaven and therefore having divine force, both forming the world but also unforming it in the end times. So, rhyming. Head and dead, but harmony and heap and began and lay obviously don't rhyme. High, dry, leap and harmony don't. Obey, began, harmony, well, harmony and harmony, although that's effectively rhyming with the one word with itself. Began, ran, man. Quell, shell, around. Quell, shell, fell. Around, sound. Dwell, shell, well, quell. Clangor. Nothing, I don't think. Arms, alarms. don't think clangor and... Obviously clangor and anger don't rhyme. I don't think they would have been pronounced rhymingly. No, they could, couldn't they? Clangor, anger. No, perhaps those were supposed to rhyme. Arms, alarms, beat, retreat, drum come, flute. Nothing, I don't think. Discovers lovers. Oh, flute and lute. That's an interesting structure. A-B-B-A. A-B-B-A. Proclaim. Desperation, indignation. Oh, desperation and indignation. I don't think dame and passion rhyme with anything. Teach, reach. Love above. Praise, ways. So A, BC, BC. Race, place, liar. Higher. So race, place, liar, higher. Given, heaven. Not really. Nearly, but not really. Appeared, doesn't. Lays, praise. Move and above don't rhyme, but they both end in OVE. There is a name for that, isn't there? Don't they just call it a visual rhyme or something like that? I don't think I have it written down, but I think they call it a sight rhyme or something like that. I doubt move and above would have been pronounced similarly back then, though. Can't rule it out. Since this was written over 300 years ago. Hour, devour, high, die, sky. So, I don't think there's a clear structure to the rhyming. I couldn't see a recurring structure there. But there is a lot of end rhyme, even though it's not structured. I mean, it goes through periods where it's structured, where you might get an AB, AB, or AA, BB, CC, and so on. But then it just shifts to some other structure. So, and in some cases seems to follow odd structures, which you don't often see, like ABBA and that sort of thing. So, in terms of sounds, you're going to notice the rhyming, but I don't think it's really strict about sticking to a specific structure. And then we have the question of rhythm. So let me count syllables quietly. Yeah, 11 syllables on the first line. That's a lot. Eight on the next. Eight again. 6. 6. 8. 6. 8. 8. 7. 11. So yeah, I suspect we're going to find much the same as with the rhyming, that there's a tendency for it to repeat itself within a specific section, that a certain number of syllables will, in each sentence, will, in each, in each verse, will tend to occur over and over again, but that overall there's no clear structure. I could be wrong because I'm no expert on poetry, but I don't think this is following a strict form in the way you might expect from iambic pentameter or a haiku or anything like that. I think it's a lot more freeform, but at the same time there has been a lot of attention paid to the sound of the poetry. And so creating structure and order in smaller sections. Could be wrong, but that's my initial assessment. Well, that is my assessment. Is there any... I will move on to the final reading now. If anyone has any questions, please put them into chat. From harmony, from heavenly harmony, this universal frame began. When nature underneath a heap of jarring atoms lay, and could not heave her head, the tuneful voice was heard from high, Arise ye more than dead, then cold and hot and moist and dry, in order to their stations leap, and music's power obey. From harmony, from heavenly harmony, this universal frame began. From harmony to harmony, through all the compass of the notes it ran, the diapason closing full in man. When passion cannot music raise and quell, when Jubal struck the chorded shell, his listening brethren stood around, and wondering on their faces fell, to worship that celestial sound, less than a god they thought there could not dwell, within the hollow of that shell, that spoke so sweetly and so well, that passion cannot music raise and quell. The trumpet's loud clangor excites us to arms, with shrill notes of anger and mortal alarms. The double, double, double beat of the thundering drum cries, hark, the foes come. Charge, charge, 'tis too late to retreat. The soft complaining flute in dying notes discovers the woes of hopeless lovers, whose dirges whispered by the warbling lute. Sharp violins proclaim their jealous pangs and desperation, fury, frantic indignation, depths of pain and height of passion, for the fair disdainful dame. But oh, what art can teach, what human voice can reach, the sacred organ's praise, notes inspiring holy love, notes that wing their heavenly ways to mend the choirs above. Orpheus could lead the savage race, and trees uprooted left their place, sequacious of the lyre, but bright Cecilia raised the wonder higher. When to her organ vocal breath was given, an angel heard and straight appeared, mistaking earth for heaven. As from the power of sacred lays, the spheres began to move and sung the great Creator's praise to all the blessed above. So when last and dreadful hour, my apologies. So when the last and dreadful hour this crumbling pageant shall devour, the trumpet shall be heard on high, the dead shall live, the living die, and music shall untune the sky. So, although it took us the entire duration we usually set aside for reading poetry, meaning we'll be moving on to Pride and Prejudice shortly, I do think this was a very interesting poem, both in terms of its historical context and its structure and the meaning contained within. I do like it a lot. Anyway, if there's no questions, then we shall move on to Pride and Prejudice. So, due to the increasing length of the recaps I keep doing for Pride and Prejudice to cover the entire story from chapter 1, I think from now on I will only recap the last few chapters, unless someone specifically asks me in chat to cover more. It's a shame in a way, because if someone was listening to this for the first time, they couldn't rely on my recap to bring them fully abreast with the story. But on the other hand, it was getting to the point when I was spending 20 minutes or more recapping the story on its own before I was actually getting into the new stuff. So I think it's the right decision that I only recap the last few chapters. So, I'm going to arbitrarily decide that I'm going to go recap the last 3 chapters. That brings us back to chapter 2. Sorry, chapter 20, I meant to say. So in chapter 20, we find out that Mrs. Bennet was very unhappy with Elizabeth, having turned down Mr. Collins' proposal of marriage. She pointed out the dangers of spinsterhood and made some very melodramatic statements towards her, of the sort of "I won't speak to you again," that sort of thing. Mr. Bennet, that is Elizabeth's father, sided with Elizabeth. Then Mr. Collins finally withdrew his pretensions to Elizabeth's favour and apologised. Then in chapter 21, Elizabeth reunites with Mr. Wickham in Meryton, where they walk and talk together. Mr. Bingley takes a trip to town, and in a letter, Miss Bingley, who was apparently accompanying him along with the rest of Mr. Bingley's close associates, she tries to convince Jane that they will be staying there for the winter, that is 6 months, and suggests that Mr. Bingley may marry Mr. Darcy's sister in the near future. Of course, Mr. Darcy is Jane's love interest. Sorry, Mr. Bingley is Jane's love interest, which means that she would not want Mr. Darcy marrying... I am mucking this up a lot, aren't I? I apologise. So just to state what I was just trying to state more clearly, Jane receives a letter from Miss Bingley, that is Mr. Bingley's sister, which informs her that she expects they will be staying in town, that is Mr. Bingley and his associates, for the duration of the winter, meaning about 6 months, and also suggests that Mr. Bingley may marry Mr. Darcy's sister, which naturally Jane would not be happy with. Elizabeth suspects this as simply as Miss Bingley hopes that, having achieved one marriage between the families, that is the Bingley and Darcy families, it would be more easy for her to achieve a second intermarriage, because of course Miss Bingley hopes she will be able to marry Mr. Darcy. Then in chapter 22, Mr. Collins and Miss Lucas being Elizabeth's best friend, become engaged. Miss Lucas felt that marriage is the only provision for well-educated young women of small fortune, and however uncertain of giving happiness, must be their pleasantest preservative from want. So in other words, she was scared of the dangers of spinsterhood, especially since she is not from a overly rich family. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was flabbergasted that she would sacrifice every better feeling to worldly advantage. So in other words, Elizabeth feels that you should only marry for love, since, at least back then, marriage was certainly seen as for life, and if you married someone whose company you found irksome, then you were setting yourself up for an unhappy life. whereas Miss Lucas was being more pragmatic and thinking in terms of, well, how's she going to support herself for the rest of her life? Repeatedly, the book has suggested that Miss Lucas wasn't the most attractive young lady, and I believe she was 27 at this point, which is quite old to marry. Not unheard of in those times for a young woman. Of course, in these times, the men tended to be slightly older than their wives, not exclusively, but there was a tendency. So I don't think a young man marrying at 27 would have been seen at all unusual. But for a woman, that's getting a bit old. Certainly, I think by the time they reached their 30s, at this point in history, that would have been seen as they're seen as the point at which they will have married if they're likely to at all, I would suggest. So Miss Lucas, getting older, not having had many other opportunities for marriage, not being considered to be most eligible, being neither overly attractive nor wealthy, saw this as an opportunity to provide for herself into the future, whereas Elizabeth felt that it was foolish to marry someone that you don't love. So that's where we're at. So, chapter 23. Elizabeth was sitting with her mother and sisters, reflecting on what she had heard, and doubting whether she was authorised to mention it, when Sir William Lucas himself appeared, sent by his daughter to announce her engagement to the family. With many compliments to them, and much self-congratulation on the prospect of a connection between the houses, he unfolded the matter, to an audience not merely wondering, but incredulous. For Mrs. Bennet, with more perseverance and politeness, protested he must be entirely mistaken, and Lydia, always unguarded and often uncivil, boisterously exclaimed, "Good Lord, Sir William, how can you tell such a story? Do you know that Mr. Collins wants... Do you not know... My apologies. Do not you know that Mr. Collins wants to marry Lizzie?" Nothing less than the complacence of a courtier could have borne without anger such treatment. But Sir William's good breeding carried him through it all, and though he begged leave to be positive as to the truth of his information, he listened to all their impertinence with the most forbearing courtesy. Elizabeth... actually, just a second. I want to look up how the word courtier here, because presumably that would be someone that goes to court. But I'm wondering if they're using it to refer to someone of breeding. No, that's not what I was looking up. There we go. A person in attendance of royal court, a person who flatters in order to seek favour. Yes, I'm not entirely sure what they mean by the complacence of a courtier. I must have misspelled that. I did. The courtier being complacent, amiable or agreeable. Compliant, willing to please. Okay. Yes, I suppose they do just mean the good nature of someone that goes to court, I guess. I mean, he is Sir William, so clearly he's been knighted, so perhaps that means he's a courtier, because he's been to court to be knighted. Or perhaps they are just using it to mean someone of good breeding. Anyway, I shall continue. Elizabeth, feeling it incumbent on her to relieve him from so unpleasant a situation, now put herself forward to confirm his account by mentioning her prior knowledge of it from Charlotte herself, and endeavoured to put a stop to the exclamations of her mother and sisters by the earnestness of her congratulations to Sir William, in which he was readily joined by Jane, and by making a variety of remarks on the happiness that might be expected from the match, the excellent character of Mr. Collins, and the convenient distance of Hunsford from London. Mrs. Bennet was in fact too much overpowered to say a great deal while Sir William remained, but no sooner had he left than her feelings found a rapid vent. In the first place, she persisted in disbelieving the whole of the matter. Secondly, she was very sure that Mr. Collins had been taken in. Thirdly, she entrusted that they would never be happy together, and fourthly, that the match might be broken off. Two inferences, however, were plainly deduced from the whole. One, that Elizabeth was the real cause of the mischief, and the other, that she herself had been barbarously misused by them all. And on these 2 points she principally dwelt during the rest of the day. Nothing could console and nothing could appease her, nor did that day wear out her resentment. A week elapsed before she could see Elizabeth without scolding her. A month passed away before she could speak to Sir William or Lady Lucas without being rude, and many months were gone before she could at all forgive their daughter. Mr. Bennet's emotions were much more tranquil on the occasion, and such as he did experience he pronounced to be of a most agreeable sort. For it gratified him, he said, to discover that Charlotte Lucas, whom he had been used to think tolerably sensible, was as foolish as his wife, and more foolish than his daughter. Jane confessed herself a little surprised at the match, but she said less of her astonishment than of her earnest desire for their happiness, nor could Elizabeth persuade her to consider it as improbable. Kitty and Lydia were far from envying Miss Lucas, for Mr. Collins was only a clergyman, and it affected them in no other way than as a piece of news to spread at Meryton. Lady Lucas could not be insensible of triumph on being able to retort on Mrs. Bennet the comfort of having a daughter well married, and she called at Longbourn rather oftener than usual to say how happy she was, though Mrs. Bennet's sour looks and ill-natured remarks might have been enough to drive happiness away. Between Elizabeth and Charlotte there was a restraint which kept them mutually silent on the subject, and Elizabeth felt persuaded that no real confidence could ever subsist between them again. Her disappointment in Charlotte made her turn with fonder regard to her sister, of whose rectitude and delicacy she was sure her opinion could never be shaken, and for whose happiness she grew daily more anxious, as Bingley had now been gone a week and nothing more was heard of his return. Jane had sent Caroline an early answer to her letter, and was counting the days till she might reasonably hope to hear again. The promised letter of thanks from Mr. Collins arrived on Tuesday, addressed to their father, and written with all the solemnity of gratitude which a 12 months' abode in the family might have prompted. After discharging his conscience on that head, he proceeded to inform them, with many rapturous expressions, of his happiness in having obtained the affection of their amiable neighbour Miss Lucas, and then explained that it was merely with the view of enjoying her society that he had been so ready to close with their kind wish of seeing him again at Longbourn, whither he hoped to be able to return on Monday fortnight. For Lady Catherine, he added, so heartily approved his marriage that she wished it to take place as soon as possible, which he trusted would be an unanswerable argument with his amiable Charlotte to name an early day for making him the happiest of men. I see. Sorry. That she wished it to take place as soon as possible, which he trusted would be an unanswerable argument with his amiable Charlotte to name an early day for making him the happiest of men. Mr. Collins' return into Hertfordshire was no longer a matter of pleasure to Mrs. Bennet. On the contrary, she was as much disposed to complain of it as her husband. It was very strange that she should come to Longbourn instead of to Lucas Lodge. It was also very inconvenient and exceedingly troublesome. She hated having visitors in the house while her health was so indifferent, and lovers were of all people the most disagreeable. Such were the gentle murmurs of Mrs. Bennet that they gave way only to the greater distress of Mr. Bingley's continued absence. Neither Jane nor Elizabeth were comfortable on this subject. Day after day passed away without bringing any other tidings of him than the report which shortly prevailed in Meryton of his coming no more to Netherfield the whole winter, a report which highly incensed Mrs. Bennet, and which she never failed to contradict as a most scandalous falsehood. Even Elizabeth began to fear, not that Bingley was indifferent, but that his sisters would be successful in keeping him away, unwilling as she was to admit an idea so destructive of Jane's happiness, and so dishonourable to the stability of her lover, she could not prevent its frequently occurring. The united effort of his two unfeeling sisters and of his overpowering friend, assisted by the attractions of Miss Darcy and the amusements of London, might be too much, she feared, for the strength of his attachment. As for Jane, her anxiety under this suspense was, of course, more painful than Elizabeth's, but whatever she felt she was desirous of concealing, and between herself and Elizabeth, therefore, the subject was never alluded to. But as no such delicacy restrained her mother, an hour seldom passed in which she did not talk of Bingley, express her impatience for his arrivals, or even require Jane to confess that if he did not come back she would think herself very ill used. It needed all Jane's steady mildness to bear these attacks with tolerable tranquillity. Mr. Collins returned most punctually on Monday fortnight, but his reception at Longbourn was not quite so gracious as it had been on his first introduction. He was too happy, however, to need much attention, and luckily for the others, the business of love-making relieved them from a great deal of his company. The chief of every day was spent by him at Lucas Lodge, and he sometimes returned to Longbourn only in time to make an apology for his absence before the family went to bed. Mrs. Bennet was really in a most pitiable state. The very mention of anything concerning the match threw her into an agony of ill humour, and wherever she went she was sure of hearing it talked of. The sight of Miss Lucas was odious to her. As her successor in that house, she regarded her with jealous abhorrence. Whenever Charlotte came to see them, she concluded her to be anticipating the hour of possession, and whenever she spoke in a low voice to Mr. Collins, she was convinced that they were talking of the Longbourn estate, and resolving to turn herself and her daughters out of the house as soon as Mr. Bennet were dead. She complained bitterly of all this to her husband. "Indeed, Mr. Bennet," said she, "it's very hard to think that Charlotte Lucas should ever be mistress of this house, that I should be forced to make way for her, and live to see her take her place in it. My dear, do not give way to such gloomy thoughts. Let us hope for better things. Let us flatter ourselves that I may be the survivor." This was not very consoling to Mrs. Bennet, and therefore, instead of making any answer, she went on as before. "I cannot bear to think that they should have all this estate. If it was not for the entail, I should not mind it." What should not you mind? I should not mind anything at all. Let us be thankful that you are preserved from a state of such insensibility. I never can be thankful, Mr. Bennet, for anything about the entail. How anyone could have the conscience to entail away an estate from one's own daughters, I cannot understand, and all for the sake of Mr. Collins too. Why should he have it more than anybody else? I leave it to yourself to determine, said Mr. Bennet. Chapter 24. Miss Bingley's letter arrived and put an end to doubt. The very first sentence conveyed the assurance of their being all settled in London for the winter, and concluded with her brother's regret at not having had time to pay his respects to his family in Hertfordshire before he left the country. Hope was over, entirely over, and when Jane could attend to the rest of the letter, she found little except the professed affection of the writer that could give her any comfort. Miss Darcy's praise accompanied the chief of it. Her many attractions were again dwelt on, and Caroline boasted joyfully of their increasing intimacy, and ventured to predict the accomplishment of the wishes which had been unfolded in her former letter. She wrote also with great pleasure of her brother's being an intimate of Mr. Darcy's house, an inmate of Mr. Darcy's house, and mentioned with rapture some plans of the latter with regard to new furniture. Elizabeth, to whom Jane very soon communicated the chief of all this, heard it in silent indignation. Her heart was divided between concern for her sister and resentment against all others. To Caroline's assertion of her brother's being partial to Miss Darcy she paid no credit. That he was really fond of Jane she doubted no more than she had ever done, and much as she had always been disposed to like him, she could not think without anger, hardly without contempt, on the easiness of temper, that want of proper resolution, which now made him the slave of his designing friends, and led him to sacrifice of his own happiness to the caprice of their inclination. Had his own happiness, however, been the only sacrifice, he might have been allowed to sport with it in whatever manner he thought best, but her sister was involved in it, and she thought he must be sensible himself. It was a subject, in short, on which reflection would be long indulged, and must be unavailing. She could think of nothing else, and yet whether Bingley's regard had really died away, or was suppressed by his friend's interference, whether he had been aware of Jane's attachment, or whether it had escaped his observation, whatever were the case, though her opinion of him must be materially affected by the difference, her sister's situation remained the same, her peace equally wounded. A day or two passed before Jane had the courage to speak of her feelings to Elizabeth, but last, on Mrs. Bennet's leaving them together, after a longer irritation than usual about Netherfield and its master, she could not help saying, "Oh, that my dear mother had more command over herself! She can have no idea of the pain she gives me by her continual reflections on him. But I will not repine. It cannot last long. He will be forgot, and we shall all be as we were before." Elizabeth looked at her sister with incredulous solitude, but said nothing. "You doubt me," cried Jane, slightly colouring. "Indeed, you have no reason. He may live in my memory as the most amiable man of my acquaintance, but that is all. I have nothing either to hope or fear, and nothing to reproach him with. Thank God, I have not that pain. A little time, therefore, I shall certainly try to get the better." With a stronger voice she soon added, "I have this comfort immediately, that it has not been more than an error of fancy on my side, and that it has done no harm to anyone but myself." "My dear Jane," exclaimed Elizabeth, "you are too good. Your sweetness and disinterestedness are really angelic. I do not know what to say to you. I feel as if I had never done you justice, or loved you as you deserve." Miss Bennet eagerly disclaimed all extraordinary merit, and threw back the praise on her sister's warm affection. "Nay," said Elizabeth, "this is not fair. You wish to think all the world respectable, and are hurt if I speak ill of anybody. I only want to think you perfect, and you set yourself against it. Do not be afraid of my running into any excess, of my encroaching on your privilege of universal good will. You need not. There are few people whom I really love, and still fewer whom I think well. The more I see of the world, the more I am dissatisfied with it, and every day confirms my belief of the inconsistency of all human characters, and of the little dependence that can be placed on the appearance of merit or sense. I have met with two instances lately. One I will not mention, the other is Charlotte's marriage. It is uncountable. In every view it is unaccountable. My dear Lizzie, do not give way to such feelings as these. They will ruin your happiness. You do not make allowance enough for the difference of situation and temper. Consider Mr. Collins' respectability, and Charlotte's steady, prudent character. Remember that she is one of a large family, that as to fortune it is a most eligible match, and be ready to believe for everybody's sake that she may feel something like regard and esteem for our cousin. To oblige you, I would try to believe almost anything, but no one else could be benefited by such a belief as this, for were I persuaded that Charlotte had any regard for him, I should only think worse of her understanding than I now do of her heart. My dear Jane, Mr. Collins is a conceited, pompous, narrow-minded, silly man. You know he is, as well as I do. You must feel, as well as I do, that the woman who married him cannot have a proper way of thinking. You shall not offend her, though it is Charlotte Lucas. You shall not, for the sake of one individual, change the meaning of principle and integrity, or endeavour to persuade yourself or me that selfishness is prudence, and insensibility of dangers an insensibility of danger security for happiness. And insensibility of dangers. An insensibility of danger security for happiness. Let me say that again. Nor endeavour to persuade yourself or me that selfishness is prudence, and insensibility of danger security for happiness. I must think your language too strong in speaking of both, replied Jane, and I hope you will be convinced of it by seeing them happy together. But enough of this. You alluded to something else. You mentioned 2 instances. I cannot misunderstand you, but I entreat you, dear Lizzie, not to pain me by thinking that person to blame, and saying your opinion of him is sunk. We must not be so ready to fancy ourselves intentionally injured. We must not expect a lively young man to be always so guarded and circumspect. It is very often nothing but our own vanity that deceives us. Women fancy admiration means more than it does, and men take care that they should. If it is designedly done, they cannot be justified, but I have no idea of there being so much design in the world as some persons imagine. I am far from attributing any part of Mr. Bingley's conduct to design, said Elizabeth, but without scheming to do wrong, or to make others unhappy, there may be error, and there may be misery. Thoughtlessness, want of attention to other people's feelings, and want of resolution will do the business. And do you impute it to either of these? Yes, to the last, but if I go on I shall displease you by saying what I think of persons you esteem. Stop me whilst you can. You persist then in supposing his sisters influence him? Yes, in conjunction with his friend. I cannot believe it. Why should they try to influence him? They can only wish his happiness, and if he is attached to me, no other woman can secure it. Your first position is false. They may wish many things besides his happiness. They may wish his increase of wealth and consequence. They may wish him to marry a girl who has all the importance of money, great connections, and pride. Beyond a doubt, they do wish him to choose Miss Darcy, replied Jane, but this may be from better feelings than you are supposing. They have known her much longer than they have known me. No wonder if they love her better. But whatever may be their own wishes, it is very unlikely they should have opposed their brothers. What sister would think herself at liberty to do it, unless there was something very objectionable? If they believed him attached to me, they would not try to part us. If he were so, they could not succeed. By supposing such an affection, you make everybody acting unnaturally and wrong, and me most unhappy. Do not distress me by the idea. I am not ashamed of having been mistaken, or at least it is light. It is nothing in comparison of what I should feel in thinking ill of him or his sisters. Let me take it in the best light, in the light in which it may be understood. Elizabeth could not oppose such a wish, and from this time Mr. Bingley's name was scarcely ever mentioned between them. Mrs. Bennet still continued to wonder and repine at his returning no more, and though a day seldom passed in which Elizabeth did not account for it clearly, there was little chance of her ever considering it with less perplexity. Her daughter endeavoured to convince her of what she did not believe herself, and that his attentions to Jane had been merely the effect of a common and transient liking, which ceased when he saw her no more. But though the probability of the statement was admitted at the time, she had the same story to repeat every day. Mrs. Bennet's best comfort was that Mr. Bingley must be down again in the summer. Mr. Bennet treated the matter differently. So, Lizzie, said he one day, your sister is crossed in love, I find. I congratulate her. Next to being married, a girl likes to be crossed a little in love now and then. It is something to think of, and it gives her a sort of distinction among her companions. When is your turn to come? You'll hardly bear to be long outdone by Jane. Now is your time. Here are officers enough in Meryton to disappoint all the young ladies in the country. Let Wickham be your man. He is a pleasant fellow, and will jilt you creditably. Thank you, sir, but a less agreeable man would satisfy me. We must not all expect Jane's good fortune. True, said Mr. Bennet, but it is a comfort to think that whatever of that kind may befall you, you have an affectionate mother who will make the most of it. Mr. Wickham's society was of material service in dispelling the gloom which the late perverse occurrences had thrown on many of the Longbourn family. They saw him often, and to his other recommendations was now added that of general unreserve. The whole of what Elizabeth had already heard, his claims on Mr. Darcy, and all he had suffered from him, was now openly acknowledged and publicly canvassed, and everybody was pleased to know how much they had always disliked Mr. Darcy before they had known anything of the matter. Miss Bennet was the only creature who could suppose there might be any extenuating circumstances in the case, unknown to the society of Hertfordshire. Her mild and steady candour always pleaded for allowances, and urged the possibility of mistakes, but by everybody else Mr. Darcy was condemned as the worst of men. Chapter 25. After a week spent in professions of love and schemes of felicity, Mr. Collins was called from his amiable Charlotte by the arrival of Saturday. The pain of separation, however, might be alleviated on his side by preparations for the reception of his bride, as he had reason to hope that shortly after his return into Hertfordshire the day would be fixed that was to make him the happiest of men. He took leave of his relations at Longbourn with as much solemnity as before, wished his fair cousin's health and happiness again, and promised her father another letter of thanks. On the following Monday, Mrs. Bennet had the pleasure of receiving her brother and his wife, who came as usual to spend Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardiner was a sensible, gentlemanlike man, greatly superior to his sister, as well by nature as education. The Netherfield ladies would have had difficulty in believing what a man who lived by trade, and within view of his own warehouses, could have been so well bred and agreeable. So, for context, where it says within view of his own warehouses, traditionally, the English well-to-do would have been born into wealth. They would have been from noble families, or at least from families within the chivalric orders, and they would have had money, they would have had land, and would have just been living off of rent and other forms of payment that they were due. They did not work in the traditional sense. I mean, that they would have had a lot of responsibilities, and their days would have been filled with important things to do, but there was a distinction in society between the working classes and everyone else. Now, the reason this is significant is that during the Industrial Revolution, the middle classes grew massively. And in particular, you had a lot of families come into wealth who were doing jobs which traditionally would have been seen as work. They were merchants, for example. That would have been seen as being a working class job, as in they aren't well to do, but they could have had a lot of money. And as I say, during the Industrial Revolution, a lot of families from the middle classes grew, so there were a lot more people with money who were whose money came from sources other than land or other entitlements. This then creates a situation where you have people who, to rise up in society, to rise up in status and standing, it's very much in their interest to play down where their money's actually coming from. We see this in the case of Sir William Lucas, because they previously mentioned his family came from trade, but then he made a lot of money, I think. He got knighted, and so he eventually bought up some land and then tried to cut all ties with his family's business. He just sold on the business, I think, and is now living more as the traditional English aristocracy would have done, although significantly less wealthy than an actual noble. And that's a significant point in the family's history, that they are cutting ties with their traditional source of income. Now, this is where all this business about the Netherfield ladies would have had difficulty in believing that a man who lived by trade and within view of his own warehouses could have been so well-bred and agreeable. That's where this is coming from. Because, of course, having status, having standing in society, being well-bred, is associated with being gentlemanlike or ladylike and being agreeable and all these other things. And so the reason they're stressing within view of his own warehouses is because during this period in history, it was considered in incredibly poor taste if you were, if your money did come from business, to live within sight of where that business was done. So if you were a businessman and that's where your money came from, you were supposed to own a house which was far enough away from your business that you couldn't see it. So, visitors coming to see you and so on would not see where the money was coming from. And this was a big deal. And so the point about within view of his own warehouses, that's quite the damning thing, believe it or not. To have his house within view of his own warehouses suggests either that he doesn't care about people seeing where his money's coming from, or that he just isn't wealthy enough to live elsewhere. But as the book is clearly making the point, he behaves well-bred and agreeable. So that's what's going on there for anyone that wasn't familiar. The individual on discussion is Mr. Gardner, who is apparently Mrs. Bennet's brother. And he and his wife are visiting the family in Longbourn. So, Mrs. Gardner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was an amiable, intelligent, elegant woman, and a great favourite with all her Longbourn nieces. Between the two eldest and herself especially, there subsisted a particular regard. They had frequently been staying with her in town. The first part of Mrs. Gardner's business on her arrival was to distribute her presents and describe the newest fashions. When this was done, she had a less active part to play. It became her turn to listen. Mrs. Bennet had many grievances to relate, and much to complain of. They had all been very ill used since she last saw her sister. 2 of her girls had been upon the point of marriage, and after all there was nothing in it. I do not blame Jane, she continued, for Jane would have got Mr. Bingley if she could, but Lizzie, oh, sister, it is very hard to think that she might have been Mr. Collins's wife by this time, and it had not been for her own had it not been for her own perverseness. He made her an offer in this very room, and she refused him. The consequence of it is that Lady Lucas will have a daughter married before I have, and that the Longbourn estate is just as much entailed as ever. The Lucases are very artful people indeed, sister. They are all for what they can get. I'm sorry to say it of them, but so it is. It makes me very nervous and poorly to be thwarted so in my own family, and to have neighbours who think themselves before anybody else. However, your coming at this time is the greatest of comforts. I am very glad to hear what you tell us of long sleeves. Mrs. Gardiner, to whom the chief of this news had been given before, in the course of Jane and Elizabeth's correspondence with her, made her sister a slight answer, and in compassion to her nieces, turned the conversation. When alone with Elizabeth afterward, she spoke more on the subject. It seems likely to have been a desirable match for Jane, said she. I'm sorry it went off, but these things happen so often. A young man, such as you described, Mr. Bingley, so easily falls in love with a pretty girl for a few weeks, and when accident separates them, so easily he forgets her, and that these sorts of inconsistencies are very frequent. An excellent consolation in its way, said Elizabeth, but it will not do for us. We do not suffer by accident. It does not often happen that the interference of friends will persuade a young man of independent fortune to think no more of a girl whom he was violently in love with only a few days before. But that expression of violently in love is so hackneyed, so doubtful, so indefinite, that it gives me very little idea. It is often applied to feelings which arise from a half-hour's acquaintance, as to a real strong attachment. Pray, how violent was Mr. Bingley's love? I never saw a more promising inclination. He was growing quite inattentive to other people, and wholly engrossed by her. Every time they met, it was more decided and more remarkable. At his own ball he offended 2 or 3 young ladies by not asking them to dance, and I spoke to him twice myself without receiving an answer. Could there be finer symptoms? Is not general incivility the very essence of love? Oh, yes, of that kind of love which I suppose him to have felt. Poor Jane! I'm sorry for her, because with her disposition, she may not get over it immediately. It had better have happened to you, Lizzie. You would have laughed yourself out of it sooner. But do you think she would be prevailed upon to go back with us? Change of scene might be of service, and perhaps a little relief from home may be useful as anything. Elizabeth was exceedingly pleased with the proposal, and felt persuaded of her sister's ready acquiescence. I hope, added Mrs. Gardiner, that no consideration with regard to this young man will influence her. We live in so different a part of town. All our connections are so different, and, as you well know, we go out so little, that it is very improbable that they should meet at all, unless he really comes to see her. And that is quite impossible, for he is now in the custody of his friend, and Mr. Darcy would no more suffer him call on Jane in such a part of London. My dear aunt, how could you think of it? Mr. Darcy may perhaps have heard of such a place as Gracechurch Street, but he would hardly think a month's ablution enough to cleanse him from its impurities, were he once to enter it, and depend upon it, Mr. Bingley never stirs without him. Ablution. The act of washing something. The act of washing or cleansing the body or some part of it as a religious rite. From the mid-16th century. Western Christianity. The rinsing of the priest's hands and sacred vessel following the communion with, depending on rite, water or a mix of it and wine, which may then be drunk by the priest. So much the better. I hope they will not meet at all. But does not Jane correspond with his sister? She will not be able to help calling. She will drop the acquaintance entirely. But in spite of the certainty in which Elizabeth affected to place this point, as well as the still more interesting one of Bingley's being withheld from seeing Jane, she felt a solicitude on the subject which convinced her on examination that she did not consider it entirely hopeless. It was possible and sometimes she thought it probable that his affection might be reanimated, and the influence of his friends successfully combated by the more natural influence of Jane's attractions. Miss Bennet accepted her aunt's invitation with pleasure. Miss Bennet, of course, being Jane, because the eldest daughter was always Miss surname, and the younger daughters would be Miss first name surname. Miss Bennet accepted her aunt's invitation with pleasure, and the Bingleys were no otherwise in her thoughts at the same time than as she hoped by Caroline's not living in the same house with her brother. She might occasionally spend a morning with her without any danger of seeing him. The gardener stayed a week at Longbourn, and what with the Phillipses, the Lucases, and the officers, there was not a day without its engagement. Mrs. Bennet had so carefully provided for the entertainment of her brother and sister that they did not once sit down to a family dinner. When the engagement was for home, some of the officers always made part of it, of which officers Mr. Wickham was sure to be one, and on these occasions, Mrs. Gardiner, rendered suspicious by Elizabeth's warm commendation, narrowly observed them both, without supposing them, from what she saw, to be very seriously in love. Their preference of each other was plain enough to make her a little uneasy, and she resolved to speak to Elizabeth on this subject before she left Hertfordshire, and represent to her the imprudence of encouraging such an attachment. To Mrs. Gardiner, Wickham had one means of affording pleasure, unconnected with his general powers. About 10 or a dozen years ago, before her marriage, she had spent a considerable time in that very part of Derbyshire to which he belonged. They had, therefore, many acquaintances in common, and though Wickham had been little there since the death of Darcy's father, it was yet in his power to give her fresher intelligence of her former friends than she had been in the way of procuring. Mrs. Gardiner had seen Pemberley, and known the late Mr. Darcy by character perfectly well. Here, consequently, was an inexhaustible subject of discourse. In comparing her recollections of Pemberley with the minute descriptions which Wickham could give, and in bestowing her tribute of praise on the character of its late possessor, she was delighting both him and herself. On being made acquainted with the present Mr. Darcy's treatment of him, she tried to remember some of that gentleman's reputed disposition when quite a lad, which might agree with it, and was confident at last that she recollected having heard Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy formerly spoken of as a very proud, ill-natured boy. So, I think that will do for Pride and Prejudice this week. Is there anything anyone would like to discuss regarding Pride and Prejudice? If there is, please put it in chat. And very shortly we will move on to riddles. So, riddles. I believe 56 was the last one that we covered last week. So, before creating nature willed, that atoms into form should rear, by me the boundless space was filled, on me was built the first made star. For me a saint will break his word, by the proud atheist I'm adored, at me the coward draws his sword, and by the hero I am feared, scorned by the meek and humble mind, yet often by the vain possessed, heard by the deaf, seen by the blind, I'm to the troubled conscience rest, that wisdom's sacred self I'm wiser, though yet by every blockhead known, I'm freely given by the miser, kept by the prodigal alone. The king, God bless him, as 'tis said, by me is put into a passion, yet even him I can persuade to act against his inclination, as vice deformed, as virtue fair, the courtier's loss, the patriot's gain, the poet's wealth, the coxcomb's care, read and you have it for your pains. And the solution to that riddle is, of course, nothing. I say of course as if it didn't take, as if I wasn't struggling with it last week. Anyway, so we move on to 57. A thing without which, 'tis my real belief, you seldom would choose the best way to dress beef. A song, though I own it appears a strange thing, no one person on earth can possibly sing. 'Tis the name of a man who holds a good place, though some in high station turn from him their face. This one seems particularly difficult. Jenny says the name of a man, so the solution is a historical character? Possibly. Although it might be it's possible that it's not the Christian name of an individual, but rather an occupational role. Like, for example, 'tis the name of a man who holds a good place, supposing the answer was the king. That would also make sense. Or it could be literal, it could be a word for someone that holds a good place. Like nobility, or something like that. So, a thing without which, 'tis my real belief, you seldom would choose the best way to dress beef. that thing has that particular pair of lines is confusing me no end. A song though I own it appears a strange thing, no person on earth can possibly sing. No one person on earth can possibly sing. So I mean that makes more sense. I mean, a duet, for example. No one person can sing a duet. 'Tis the name of a man who holds a good place. To dress beef, I believe, means to... I believe it is a culinary reference to pairing one thing with another. Let me look up the exact meaning. In butchering, to dress can mean to cut up for food, or to remove the internal organs, to prepare food for cooking or eating, especially by seasoning it, specifically to add a dressing or sauce. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there's one I really should have been able to tell you off the top of my head. So yeah, it means to season food or to put a sauce on it. That's what to dress means. Jenny suggests the solution could be a butcher. A song though I own, it appears a strange thing, no person on earth can possibly sing. That wouldn't be a butcher. And they say, 'tis the name of a man who holds a good place, though some in high station turn from him their face. I mean, it's plausible that they would have turned their face from a butcher. I honestly don't know to what degree it would have been seen as acceptable to ignore the working classes to the extent of turning your face from them. Like, I can understand that if you were someone of high station, you wouldn't regularly socialise with working class people, but that's quite different to turning your face from them. I mean, I could believe that, but then again, a butcher cuts up animals. I don't know if that was considered especially dirty or something. I doubt it would have been seen as especially wrong, since obviously you need someone to butcher meat so that people can eat. I mean, I know that executioners could be treated differently in some contexts. I don't know a lot of the detail, but I know, killing other human beings was treated as a special case in society. But yeah, I don't know about a butcher. I don't see a reason why people in high station would especially turn their face from butchers. But then again, I don't know for definite that they wouldn't. Jenny says, I think the answer is a person because the riddle keeps saying a man, him, the name. Well, except we have the two lines that say, a song, though I own it appears a strange thing, no one person on earth can possibly sing. See, if that were the entire poem, it would be, sorry, the entire riddle, it would clearly be, the solution would clearly be something like a duet. I'm trying to think of a name for a type of song which necessarily requires multiple people, but also happens to be the name of a particular job or role or something like that. Although, like I say, the first two sentences, a thing without which 'tis my real belief you seldom could choose the best way to dress beef, is... that's really throwing me. I'm going to suggest we look it up. I don't think I'm going to get this one, unfortunately. So this is 57. Would you like to make any guess before I... Would you like to make a guess before I find the solution? Jenny says, is it an analogy, a song that no one person on earth can possibly sing? Well, I think it's a description. Okay, I'm looking it up. Jack Catch, spelt as pronounced. Jack Catch. That makes no sense to me. Is that the Georgian equivalent of Mr. Right, Jack Catch? Yep, I can't find any reference on Wiktionary or Wikipedia to Jack Catch. It might be worth a more general internet search, but I won't do that on stream. So yeah, what a strange one. Jenny said I guessed it right. The answer is the name of a person, and he was hired as an executioner. Jack Ketch. John Ketch, generally known as Jack Ketch, was an infamous English executioner employed by King Charles II. He became famous through the way he performed his duties during the tumults of the 1680s, when he was often mentioned in broadsheet accounts that circulated through the Kingdom of England. He is thought to have been appointed in 1663. He executed the death sentences against William Russell, Lord Russell, in Lincoln's Inn Field on the 21st of July 1683, and James Scott, 1st Duke of Monmouth, on the 15th of July 1685, after the Monmouth Rebellion. Ketch's notoriety stems from barbarity at the execution of Lord Russell, the Duke of Monmouth, and other political offenders. Because of his botched executions, the name Jack Ketch is used as a proverbial name for death, Satan, and executioners. Goodness. Lord Russell's execution. On that occasion, Ketch wielded the instrument of death either with such sadistically nuanced skill, or with such lack of simple dexterity, nobody could tell which, that the victims suffered horrifically under blow after blow, each excruciating but not in itself lethal. Even among the bloodthirsty throngs that habitually attended English beheadings, the gory and agonizing display had created such outrage that Ketch felt moved to write and publish a pamphlet titled Apology, in which he excused his performance with the claim that Lord Russell had failed to dispose himself as the most suitable, and that he was therefore distracted while taking aim on his neck. James Scott, 1st Duke of Monmouth's execution. He, the Duke, would not make use of a cap or other circumstance, but lying down bid the fellow to do his office better than to the late Lord Russell, and gave him gold. But the wretch made 5 chops before he had his head off, which so incensed the people that had he not been guarded and got away, they would have torn him to pieces. If Jack Ketch is the same as Jack Catch in the answer to the riddle, then it still raises the question what they mean by a thing without which 'tis my real belief you seldom would choose the best way to dress beef. A song, though I own it appears a strange thing, no one person on earth can possibly sing. I mean, those two don't make sense. I mean, the only way I could maybe see it is if catch was used to mean a song which is catchy, and you can't have a catchy song if only one person sings it by definition. And Jack was the name of something that you would use to help you dress beef. Maybe then it makes sense. I still don't really get it though. I mean, that feels like a stretch. Still, it's historically interesting, at the very least, so thank you for sharing, Jenny. So, 58. Say, Joyce Riddlers, what am I? You'll quickly guess, if once you try, for I'm often near the breast, yet seldom visit the distressed. With happy mortals I am found, and make the hearty laugh go round. The joking shore proclaims me near, from rustic clown to courtly peer. For dwell I with mankind alone, the birds may claim me as their own. For dwell I with mankind alone, the birds may claim me as their own. And if you manage me with skill, I'll tell your fortune when you will. At least as far as this be said, I'll tell two folks who first shall wed, and do all without a head. Say, Joyous Riddlers, what am I? You'll quickly guess, if once you try. For I'm often near the breast, yet seldom visit the distress. With happy mortals I am found, and make the hearty laugh go round. The joking shore proclaims me near, from rustic clown to courtly peer. Nor dwell I with mankind alone. The bird may claim me as their own. The birds may claim me as their own. And if you manage me with skill, I'll tell your fortune when you will. At least as far as this be said, I'll tell two folks who first shall wed, and do all this without a head. Jenny says, sounds like a piece of cloth that you wear when doing a sport or job. I wonder what it means by I'll tell two folks who first shall wed. Oh, is that a continuing from... No, I don't think it is continuing from I'll tell your fortune when you will. No, it might be, mightn't it? No, I don't think it is, because there's a semicolon. I'll tell your fortune when you will, at least as far as this be said, I'll tell two folks who first shall wed, and do all this without a head. I don't think it's an item of clothing, Jenny. Oops, that's not what I meant. I meant to zoom in. But, sorry about this. Oh, I see. When I zoomed in, I think it tried to re-render the page or something. Anyway. For I'm often near the breast, yet seldom visit the distressed. I mean, it's clearly not happiness or laughter, because those are mentioned. Not humour, because the birds may claim me as their own. song. I think it's probably song, but I don't understand the reference to I'll tell your fortune when you will, at least as far as this be said, I'll tell two folks who shall wed. Particularly, I'll tell two folks who shall wed. I'll tell two folks who first shall wed. That, I assume that's a reference to some sort of song that I'm not familiar with. In fact, if it weren't for the line about the birds, I'd think dance makes more sense. Because you might see two young people dancing who are to be wed. But I'm guessing song. James said, what do you think is near the breast? I was thinking it would be an organ, a piece of clothing. Well, the lungs when you're singing. So was that 58, I think? Do you have any... would anyone else like to make a guess before I check the answer? So I'm guessing song. Merry Thought. I don't get it. I don't get it. I mean, it kind of makes sense, and then it doesn't. Like, I'll tell two folks who first shall wed. Why? Because they're sharing merry thought together? They clearly enjoy each other's company? No, I don't really get it. So, 59. Fair ladies must own that to them I am known, though some of them don't always mind me. 'Tis an easy mistake for the misses to make, who perchance know me not when they find me. But for you grown-up folk, 'tis a truth and no joke, and a shame you neglect and so flaunt me. I'm part of your creed, nay, your prayers indeed, and the scripture is nothing without me. So useful though thought, yet so oft set at naught, 'tis no wonder I'm laid on the shelf, but in searching take care, for you mayn't be aware that my half is just double myself. Well then. Fair ladies must own that to them I am known, though some of them don't always mind me. 'Tis an easy mistake for the misses to make, who perchance know me not when they find me. But for you grown-up folk, 'tis a truth and no joke, and a shame you neglect and so flaunt me. Oh, flout me, sorry, that you neglect and so flout me. I'm part of your creed, nay, your prayers indeed, and the scripture is nothing without me. So useful though thought, yet so oft set at naught, 'tis no wonder I'm laid on the shelf. But in searching take care, for you mayn't be aware that my half is just double myself. I mean, the only thing I can think is manners, but that doesn't fully make sense. Why would the scripture be nothing without it? Without manners? That doesn't fully figure. I'm gonna look this one up as well, I think. I'm not feeling confident. James says, my half is just double myself, so that means the left, right, or the upper, lower part of the thing is identical? I'm not sure. A colon. Oh, because half a colon is a full stop, which would have been said to have lasted twice as long. So I'm part of your creed, now your prayers indeed, and the scripture is nothing without me. Wow. Not sure I fully follow. Perhaps the scripture uses a lot of colons. Okay, 60. Since Diogenes' time, I'm the best habitation that ever was contrived by a civilized nation. Yet though regions so distant, no mortal ever strolls, for I visit all nations between the poles. Now Diogenes was a Greek philosopher, I believe. Was he the one that lived in a barrel, or am I confusing with another one? Diogenes was a controversial figure. He was allegedly banished from or fled from Sinope for debasement of currency. He was the son of the mint master of Sinope, and there are some debates as to whether or not he alone had debased the Sinopian currency, whether his father had done this, or whether they had both done it. After his hasty departure from Sinope, he moved to Athens, where he proceeded to criticize many cultural conventions of the Athens of that day. He modelled himself on the example of Heracles and believed that virtue was better revealed in action than in theory. He used his simple lifestyle and behaviour to criticize the social values and institutions of what he saw as a corrupt, confused society. He had a reputation for sleeping and eating wherever he chose in a highly non-traditional fashion, and took to toughening himself against nature. He declared himself a cosmopolitan and a citizen of the world rather than claiming allegiance to just one place. There are many tales about his dogging Antisthenes' footsteps and becoming his faithful hound. Diogenes made a virtue of poverty. He begged for a living and often slept in a large ceramic jar or pithos in the marketplace. I think this is the individual I was thinking of. He became notorious for his philosophical stunts, such as carrying a lamp during the day, claiming to be looking for a man, often rendered in English as looking for an honest man. He criticized Plato, disputed his interpretation of Socrates, and sabotaged his lectures, sometimes distracting listeners by bringing food and eating during the discussions. Diogenes was also noted for having mocked Alexander the Great, both in public and to his face, when he visited Corinth in 336 BC. Yes, I've heard of that story. Allegedly, it's the only time someone offended Alexander the Great and wasn't killed. I don't believe that. I think that's made up, but that's the story. That's what they say. The story I heard was that Diogenes was a well-known philosopher at the time, and he was just lying on some grass at some point, lying on the ground anyway, and Alexander the Great comes over and says, "Oh, hi, I'm Alexander the Great. I've heard of you. I respect the things you do. Is there anything I can do for you?" And then Diogenes replied, "Yes, could you move out of my sun?" So the story goes. That may be made up. Diogenes was captured by pirates and sold into slavery, eventually settling in Corinth. There he passed his philosophy of cynicism to Crates, who taught it to Zeno of Citium, who fashioned it into the school of Stoicism, one of the most enduring schools of Greek philosophy. No writing of Diogenes survived, but there are some details of his life from anecdotes, especially from Diogenes's Laertius book, Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers, and some other sources. I assume that's a different Diogenes. So yes, I think that is the individual I was thinking of. Since Diogenes' time, I'm the best habitation that ever was contrived by a civilized nation. Yet through regions so distant, no mortal ever strolls, for I visit all nations between the poles. Yet through regions so distant, no mortal ever strolls. That's interesting. So it's suggesting there's places so far away that mortals don't go there. I really don't know. This will probably be the last one tonight, but even so, I think I'm just going to look it up. I really don't know. I mean, what's really throwing me is it's described as being the best habitation. It's a place to live. That is what they would mean by habitation, isn't it? The act of inhabiting, state of inhabiting or dwelling, of or being inhabited, occupancy, a place of abode, settled dwelling, residence, house. So yes, it's described as being the best habitation, but also it visits all nations between the two poles. I mean, it's clearly not something like information, for example, as in information travelling as people talk, or rumours or anything like that, because it's a habitation. And it's not a ship, because hold on, yet through regions so distant no mortal ever strolls. I was about to say, then it's clearly not a ship if no mortal ever goes there. But you could argue that they're not strolling there if they're on a ship. I mean, yes, people walk on a ship, but you could make an argument that if it's transport by ship, they're not strolling to the distant region. But then again, that's got nothing to do with it being a distant place. It's just a sea. So I don't know. Jenny says something that used to be popular at the UK, but for something that used to be popular in the UK throughout the nation. So it is a shame to look up all 4 of the riddles tonight, but I really don't know. A ship. Oh, it was a ship. Well, that's especially vexing. To get it right, but dismiss it. Dismiss it as an impossible answer. So since Diogenes' time, well, we've had ships longer than that, but okay. Maybe they didn't realise that. I'm the best habitation that ever was contrived by a civilised nation. Well, that's clearly an opinion, but then again, Britain, very naval country. Britannia rules the waves and all that. Yet through regions so distant no mortal ever strolls. For I visit all nations between the two poles. Yeah, okay. I'm not completely satisfied with that as a riddle, but I mean, I suppose I can see it. Oh, thank you, Jenny. She said, well done, you got it right. Well, I did sort of get it right, but I also said that it couldn't possibly be the answer. So, thank you for joining me this week, everyone. I will be streaming again on Friday with more Pokemon Crystal, probably more Pokemon Crystal on Saturday as well. Then Monday, the plan is that I do Grim Fandango, since we finished Monkey Island 3 on Monday. This Monday, that is. And then the following Wednesday, it will be back to poetry, prose, and riddles. Obviously, this list of followers is very incomplete now, since I had 25 people follow me at the beginning of the stream, and I haven't had time to add them all. So I'll just read out all the new followers from today. And thank you everyone. There's Worried Land 90YX, Porsche Sun 77Z, Caesar Engbert JDX. There's Delilah Delilah Celine 9GT, Gwendolyn Nicole 7AG, Maribel, Tatiana HMC, Bainham Rosie I6R, Thornton Layla 8M, Othello Coronali, Mia Kizda, Ray especially 478, Preserve Sibiliati, Constance Emmeline 220, Abe Rionek 12, Laura L, Roy JM, Ike FWPEJR, Britta Tildamna, Reflection FEMA 6A0, Joseph LSSAMMX0, Suspicious Tushar 69H, Rahel Peter HRJ, Additional N Gaijin, Shirt Tabith AJ 36, Lisa Gwyneth 182, and Koji Tressa FYR. So if any of you are watching this, thank you. And finally, I believe Tofu is streaming, so we will raid her. Thank you again for coming, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you all have a lovely rest of your night. Good night.